It's only happened a handful of times in recorded history. A cataclysmic event that is capable of unleashing unimaginable destruction.
Oh my God! It hit my car! Oh, that car!
The superstorm. It's one of nature's most lethal phenomena.
What the hell is this?
In 2012, its name is Sandy.
It was a very, very, very large storm.
Sandy was definitely looking nasty at this stage.
A storm so powerful that every 20 minutes, it released the same amount of energy as a 10-megaton nuclear blast.
It sounded like the end of the world.
In its wake, nearly 200 lives and thousands of homes were lost.
This was God's doing.
Once considered a rare occurrence, there are those who believe superstorms like Sandy may be the new normal.
It's going to be happening all over the world.
So where does that leave us? And is there anything we can do to protect ourselves from nature's wrath? In New York City, millions of people in all 5 boroughs are beginning another work week. Along the eastern seaboard, people are winding down after a busy summer. But over 1,000 miles to the south, trouble is brewing in the Caribbean Sea. A tropical depression with winds of 30 miles per hour is forming off the north coast of Panama. It's feeding on the energy from the warm seawater.
October the 22nd, a severe sort of cluster or intense cluster of thunderstorms started to take shape in the Caribbean. You know, you couldn't miss it on the radar. It was there, it was starting to form, and anything like this makes meteorologists start to keep a close watch.
There's dozens of these things happen every single summer. They tend to peter out really by the end of September because the seas are beginning to cool off again.
But that didn't happen this time. The tropical depression starts to gain strength. With its well-formed eye and winds spinning at a constant 80 miles per hour and gusts over 100, this storm is now a Category 1 hurricane. They name it Sandy. And where it's headed is anybody's guess. All eyes are now on the Caribbean. Though it's rare for a storm this size to make landfall in America this late in the season, it's not unheard of. But since 1950, 11 named hurricanes have struck the U.S. in the month of October.
It was a tropical wave moving across the Caribbean, and around the 23rd of October, it became a named tropical system. And as often storms do at this time of year, it turned north and made landfall as a strong Category 2 hurricane.
Sandy begins to unleash hell across the Caribbean, slicing a path of destruction through Jamaica, Cuba, and Haiti. In Haiti, she dumps over 2 months of rain in a day before storming toward the Bahamas. So far, Sandy has claimed over 50 lives. As Sandy rages, forecasters spot a second threat. A winter storm is blowing in from the west. If it arrives at the same time as Sandy, it will create one massive superstorm. There are 2 possible outcomes. Sandy will either turn to the east and die in the cold Atlantic, or head for the east coast, which would be a disaster.
The concerns as she heads up the coast is what's she going to do?
With the storm's counterclockwise rotation, it won't be wind and rain that will do the damage. There's an even more destructive threat: storm surge.
Much of the damage that arises from tropical cyclones comes from the storm surge. The winds from the storm push a large mass of water towards land, tragically take things along its way. So that is one of the big dangers that arose during Sandy.
Storm surge is caused by hurricanes. The low pressure of the storm lifts the ocean into a huge mound, forcing millions of tons of water onto the coast at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. Hurricane Katrina's destructive power was not just due to high wind. The accompanying storm surge that broke the levees was responsible for the most deaths. And of all American cities, New York is most susceptible to storm surge.
The worst place to generate storm surge is here in the New York, New Jersey area. And that is because it makes a right angle with New York and New Jersey. So when a hurricane comes up, it has winds in a counterclockwise motion, and that drives all the coastal waters into the right angle. And you can't drive water into a right angle without it rising to abnormal levels.
It's inevitable if a storm with a surge of 4 meters or 13 feet hits an area like New York where the coastlines are very vulnerable, it's inevitable people are going to die.
The fate of the eastern seaboard hangs in the balance as Sandy suddenly starts moving toward the coast. It's clear something is very wrong. For everyone living on the East Coast, and especially the Northeast, the worst-case scenario is quickly becoming a reality. Sandy and that winter storm from the west will collide and morph into a superstorm.
Most storms will just turn off into the sea when they approach New Jersey. But Sandy just turned around and headed straight into us.
Why didn't Sandy turn right like most hurricanes? Because there was a high pressure over the Atlantic. And a low-pressure system is blocked by a high-pressure system. A disaster for New York.
It had joined up with these storms that had been coming across the United States, and it became this other thing. And so it was a very, very, very large storm.
Let me stress, if you don't evacuate, you're not just putting your own life in danger, you are also endangering the lives of our first responders who may have to come in and rescue you. And we hope you don't face those kinds of dire situations, but you could.
We're just going to prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Definitely think it's going to be a little more intensive than the last time.
For the waters to come up from the East River to this level would be, devastating.
With just a few hours to go until Sandy's anticipated landfall, and with more than 50 million Americans in the line of fire, President Obama declares a national emergency.
This is going to be a big storm. It's going to be a difficult storm. I'm confident that we're ready. But I think the public needs to prepare for the fact that this is going to take a long time for us to clean up.
The afternoon of Monday, October 29th. Gray skies and increasing winds signal the imminent arrival of Superstorm Sandy. It's the beginning of another work week, and yet the buzzing metropolis of New York is eerily quiet. No mass transit, no school, and for many, no work. Weather forces the closure of the New York Stock Exchange for the first time in 30 years.
We're right in the path of the storm as residents here get set to hunker down.
We are ordering this evacuation for the safety of people who live in these areas. If you live in these areas, you should leave them this afternoon.
The decision to stay on the barrier islands was a bad one, and you need to get out.
We can confirm BA has canceled all flights to the eastern United States, New York particularly, with immediate effect.
People don't want to think about bad things. And they think that hurricanes are things that form along palm-fringed shorelines. And most of them do. But every once in a while, one will come up here. And when it comes up here, it exhibits the unique pattern of a northern hurricane, which is very dangerous.
This is a serious and big storm. You need to take this very seriously and follow the instructions of your state and local officials because they are going to be providing you with the best advice in terms of how to deal with this storm over the coming days.
Is Sandy a freak of nature? Or is it the result of man-made climate change? Will we see more storms like it in the future? Coming up, Hurricane Sandy unleashes her venom on the eastern seaboard and prompts flooding of biblical proportions. On Monday, October 29th, just 7 days after a tropical depression first appeared in the Caribbean, Sandy the superstorm rages onto America's east coast.
All of this is just a little taste, though, of what is to come.
She's 1,000 miles across, with winds gusting at 70 miles an hour. The hurricane has ricocheted in the Atlantic and is heading for America's biggest city, New York.
It's quite unbelievable, really, the extent of it. And that's the problem. It doesn't really matter where it makes landfall, because hundreds of miles along that coastline, there'll be effects.
It looks like, as they do, a huge, huge circular sword.
The standing out characteristic of Sandy was its size, its sheer spatial extent. You could see it from, I think, south of Washington, D.C., all the way up to Boston.
The storm surge right now, that's just the water rise alone with this, is at 6.6 feet.
For the millions living along the coast, this beast of a storm is making landfall at the worst possible time.
With Sandy turning west, it pretty much put all of New York on what we call the strong side or the dangerous side of a storm. And so that was really unique. And not only was it typical high tide, but the tide was accentuated by the fact it was the full moon that night. So it was really the worst of every possible scenario. And that caused what we call the storm surge to be so large.
What was crucial to that large storm was that it was no longer just a hurricane when it made landfall.
In a short time, hundreds of miles of coastline will be overwhelmed by the waters of the Atlantic.
Breaking news story today, at least 13 people have been killed, thousands of homes flooded and millions of people without power after Hurricane Sandy struck the United States.
New Jersey is the first to feel the incredible power of the storm. Sandy comes ashore at 8 p.m. near Atlantic City, where the famed boardwalk is torn to pieces. Further up the coast, the resort of Seaside Heights is devoured by the waves. And out at sea to the south, the replica tall ship, the HMS Bounty, built for the film starring Marlon Brando, is ripped apart by the storm.
Survivors in the water. There's one more person in the wreck.
Its captain goes missing at sea and prompts a dramatic helicopter rescue of other crew members.
And reach that.
Bring it back into the cabin.
You actually got pulled pretty far away from the raft for being so far out.
In Lower Manhattan, the Hudson and East Rivers burst their banks. Roads become rivers, and the subway and Ground Zero fill with water.
I think people have been waiting for a long time. Certainly scientists have for New York to be hit by a major hurricane. And this is because it's so exposed, the land is very, very low, it's exposed to storm surges.
Fronts of buildings are torn away. In the heart of Midtown Manhattan, a crane is blown over and dangles precariously above the streets. And throughout the region, people are catching the devastation live on camera. The Battery, at the southern tip of Manhattan, has a water surge of almost 14 feet. And a measuring device in the outer harbor records a wave of 32 feet, beating the previous record set by Hurricane Irene just the year before.
Hurricanes are very low pressure weather systems, which means that as they travel, so the sea surface underneath comes up. The sea level is actually higher beneath these storms. On top of that, you've got these strong winds pushing the waters in front of the storm as well.
The city continues to be pounded by Sandy's wrath. A major power plant is flooded and explodes.
What the hell is this? Something, yeah, just exploded.
Half of the island of Manhattan is thrown into darkness.
Parts of New York were plunged into darkness as a record storm surge sent floodwaters pouring through lower Manhattan.
I'm currently by candlelight because there is absolutely no power anywhere in the block. I was shocked at the amount the building actually sways, and I'm currently lying on the ground in my living room because the building is swaying that much.
Meanwhile, in Queens, a massive fire breaks out.
The entire coastline has basically been rearranged by the powerful Atlantic from this hybrid monster.
Sandy was a wake-up call into what can happen when a major pure hurricane comes up here. But Sandy was clearly in a separate class because it was part tropical and part extratropical.
But is Sandy just a rogue storm, a once-in-a-100-year event? Or is she actually part of something much bigger?
Are there going to be more Hurricane Sandys in the future because of global warming is a million-dollar question.
When you get one of these rule breakers, you really have a problem.
We have to come to the realization that we are dealing with extreme weather patterns in a way that we haven't seen probably ever.
Is extreme weather the new reality? And if so, when will the next superstorm strike? Superstorm Sandy is flooding New York City. A storm surge has brought the East and Hudson rivers into lower Manhattan, and the city has been plunged into darkness.
You would never think this was happening in New York.
The entire eastern seaboard is taking the full brunt of the storm. The emergency services are pushed to their limits. Dozens of people are dying from drowning and falling debris. But the evacuation orders combined with the rapid response of FEMA have saved thousands of lives.
I think the death toll was low because people were taken out of the area, were advised to get out of the area in good time. And that really relates to the fact, again, that we can track these storms days in advance. We've got at least some warning of where they're going to go.
In freezing conditions, New Yorkers are left without heat or light. Streets and tunnels are still underwater.
My personal experience of this storm, and you know, in light of the tragedy that has befallen many other people, and you know, people that are still trying to recover everything, has been, you know, minor. It was one of inconvenience. Many days without light, family that had to huddle together in bed to stay warm. But you know, there's still people without light at home, and it's getting colder.
From Baltimore to Maine, the storm has devastated the lives of thousands of Americans. As the hurricane moves inland, its character changes again, combining with a cold front that dumps 33 inches of snow in just a couple of hours to parts of West Virginia.
Again, that was a combination of being a hurricane and being energized by the weather system that was moving across the United States.
In her final death throes, the superstorm moves north through Canada, killing more people. Power outages are reported throughout the central states.
This is the front of my house.
After a week of destruction that stretches thousands of miles, Sandy has finally blown herself out.
The worst affected areas, particularly where you have an undefended coastline like this, are going to be where the land is lowest. So we're talking about New Jersey, about Staten Island, about parts of Lower Manhattan. All areas which are essentially unprotected. They have some defences, but they're not sufficient to cope with a storm surge on this sort of scale.
Hurricane strikes on America are not uncommon. There's a long history of superstorms just as ferocious as Sandy.
When I began to see the flooding that had been done in 1821, when New York was a few tens of thousands of people, the surge rose 13 feet in 1 hour from low tide at the Battery. In 1821, there were open areas where the rain and the water could go. Now there's all covered with sidewalks and all. And when you have water hitting the ground, it has no place to go. It goes into the lowest areas, and that's exactly what happened to us in Sandy and Irene.
It's not unusual at all for tropical hurricanes to come up the East Coast and not head out into the Atlantic, as they usually do, but sometimes hit the East Coast. One of the biggest in US history is something called the Long Island Express, which struck the area in 1938. Now that, if it occurred today, would be catastrophic, far worse than Hurricane Sandy.
The 1938 hurricane reached Category 5 and killed almost 800 people. 100-mile-an-hour winds battered the Northeast and caused massive flooding. But the hurricane that has imprinted itself on the psyche of modern America more than any other is Katrina, the costliest natural disaster in the history of the country. The levees broke, and nearly 2,000 people died.
2005, we had some massive hurricanes, several Category 5 hurricanes, and Katrina was devastating. It caused hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage in the south, and that just slammed the coastline. I mean, compared to anything else we've seen, the storm surges were severe, 10 metres. The area that flooded was incredible.
Hurricane Katrina in 2005 completely devastated New Orleans. There were a number of reasons why the destruction there, the level of loss of life there was greater than New York. It was a far more powerful storm to start with, much more powerful. The point was New Orleans is almost entirely below sea level. It's crisscrossed by waterways, by canals, by river systems. It's built on a delta that's subsiding. So once the defences were breached, that water just poured effectively downhill and filled up the whole city.
Many believed Katrina was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Sandy was to prove them wrong. The superstorm has claimed the lives of almost 200 people. Millions are left without power, and thousands are homeless.
I'm alive.
Yeah.
That's it. What else is there? Family and life, and that's it.
Next, how ordinary Americans deal with the devastation of Hurricane Sandy.
Well, I won't be retiring soon, that's for sure. Just got to start all over again.
And how much has climate change contributed to this disaster?
Climate change has got a finger in there somewhere.
Superstorm Sandy has devastated the Caribbean and American East Coast. Homes have been swept away by monster waves, and the city of New York lies partially submerged in water. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power, shelter, or food. But is the superstorm man-made? How much has global warming contributed to this disaster?
Some of our research has indicated that as we continue on in this new century, storms eventually, due to anthropogenic warming, will become less frequent in the Atlantic, but will become more intense.
Hurricanes may get stronger in the future, but it's the storm surges that accompany them that are worrying the experts. Global temperatures are on the rise, leading to increased melting of glacial ice. Sea levels are rising, and the higher the sea level, the more destructive a storm surge can be, especially on the coast of New Jersey.
It occurred in an environment in which we've already experienced sea level rise of order of a foot or more over the past century along the New Jersey coast. And much of that is related to ongoing global warming. The sea level rise is a contributing factor to the actual storm surge levels that were achieved in the storm. You also have then other changes to the environment associated with global warming.
And it's not only glacier melt that is raising sea levels. As the oceans warm, they actually get bigger through thermal expansion, leading to a further rise in sea levels and a bigger threat from storm surge.
Every little bit of sea level rise is going to increase the impact we're going to get from storms in the future. We're going to see more damage due to storm surge, and that's certainly a concern of scientists, and we hope will become more concern of those people that are making policy decisions.
The water levels during Sandy rose very high, so that led to a big rush of water into the coast. We had a full moon that night, so you had the storm surge overlaying on the tide, and on top of that, you have the impact of rising sea level that we've seen over the past century. Now you'd say, well, the rising sea level is a small amount of the total storm surge, but it could be the difference between the storm surge breaching something or not. Every little bit counts at a certain point.
Whatever the reasons for the storm and flooding, for ordinary Americans, lives have been shattered.
You gotta get on this.
As the waters begin to recede, the damage can be assessed, and it's worse than anyone's ever seen before. Rockaway Beach in New York looks as if it's been shelled by missiles.
Walking by and seeing businesses that we patron, this is hitting me really hard right now. I mean, this is my life here, and these are people that I care about, and I don't even know if the character of the town is going to be the same. Yeah.
The Army is called in to assist with the recovery.
I was down at Ground Zero, and I saw for 9 months the act of a destruction by a terrorist. This was God's doing, not a terrorist. But this is worse.
The blaze at the power plant in Queens turned into one of the biggest residential fires New York has ever known. Flames shot 50 feet into the sky. 6 square blocks of houses were razed to the ground. But miraculously, no one was killed. Half of all New Yorkers killed by Sandy lived on Staten Island.
My greatest fear with Hurricane Sandy was exactly what happened. I felt that Staten Island would probably be devastated. One of my best friends called me 2 days before that their daughter was planning to visit friends in Staten Island, and I told her, whatever you do, don't let her go. That's going to be a disaster zone.
All that remains of Vincent Caravello's home is a roof, and all of his possessions have been destroyed.
But that's where we were, so you're looking at least a half a mile. We lost our way of life. Not just everything, but our way of life is gone. And I'll be 60 next year, and here we go, we start all over again. My wife is devastated, and what do? You put your tail between your legs, you pick up, and you move on. You made a comment about my sense of humor. It's either out or cry, my friend. I'm alive.
Yeah.
That's it. What else is there? Family and life, and that's it.
New Jersey has suffered as much as New York. In Atlantic City, waters have risen and come inland higher than anyone can remember. The famous boardwalk is destroyed, picked up by the storm and torn apart like matchsticks.
It sounded like the end of the world. Well, how can I put it? Actually, it sounded like a plane crashing. You know, if you can imagine that, that's what it sounded like. And this is like in our front room, so everyone shifted to the back of the house. But like my neighbors and all them, their roofs went, I mean, it was like a raging river.
People tend to think when they say we had a 14-foot surge that there was a 14-foot level of water. No, that was the beginning of the water because the wind whips up waves on top. They could be 30-foot waves on top, so you can go in and remove the second story of a house.
You see cars underwater, and then I seen a big chunk of the boardwalk, Atlantic City boardwalk, floating past my house.
For the city's residents, picking up the pieces is just the beginning.
I didn't expect this. I really didn't expect this. The devastation, and that's the only word I can use is devastation. You know, the boardwalk to be just mangled, just pieces of scrap wood, you know, and it's just, I don't know, it's just destroyed. It just really is. But it'll be okay. We'll come back, we always do, you know, so it'll be good.
On Long Beach Island, businesses are destroyed. Mark Atkinson owns an auto repair shop close to the seafront.
We left the island. Yeah, anybody with any sense would. None of us expected that kind of water. It's terrible, it's a giant mess. So I'm gonna have to box up water, you know, from records. You know, all mushy stuff. So I've seen a lot of storms, but this was a good one. Well, I won't be retiring soon, that's for sure. Just gotta start all over again.
My personal experience, at least in the New Jersey area, the central New Jersey area where Irene had a very big impact, was that people tended to take this storm very seriously. They had Irene in mind, and so people in the central New Jersey area, at least in my neighborhood and the people I knew, huddled up and got water and had their generators ready and took it very seriously.
Stephen DiPietro owns 4 restaurants on Long Beach Island. They were all flooded.
This right here, this is probably 6 feet of water right out front here. On ground level, in the middle of the street was 6, 7 feet of water. You know, with the bay right over here, You know, it just came up, the high tide here, and then ocean came down every street. Something, you know, you never want to see again. And all the dunes just came up by the waves, and Mother Nature just said, spewed it back out to us and said, here you go, you know?
I think that Sandy is a good example of the way that, in a very rapid and dramatic way, our lives can change just from a very strange weather event. And people's lives have been changed, in some cases, permanently.
The majority of damage comes from the fact that people now have houses in flood-prone areas, and you know the coastlines are built up right across the eastern coast of the United States. But add that to the foot of sea level rise that's been seen, and that's where you've got a recipe for disaster.
We have to have a better coastal policy. Many coastal geologists believe that the only true coastal policy is abandonment of the shoreline. America is the most dangerous country in the world, right? Tell me another country that has mountains on two coasts, has Arctic air in the north and tropical air in the south. That is a formula for weather disaster. And then you throw in global warming on top of that, you have a volatile mix.
Sandy was bad, but had the hurricane struck a developing nation, it could have been much worse.
I was thankful, actually, that it was so well forecast. The loss of life was really minimised. Had this kind of storm hit Bangladesh or India with the same kind of combination of factors, you know, thousands of people would have died.
And while Americans reel from one of the worst hurricanes in their history, minds turn back to the other news story of the day, the presidential election. President Obama witnesses firsthand the terrible devastation wrought by Sandy. But so far, climate change has not been mentioned during the presidential debates. Mitt Romney finds this out to his peril when he's heckled at a rally in Virginia Beach.
The US is a bit of an anomaly in terms of how the climate change debate has played out. It's been so politicised and so divisive. It isn't really the case elsewhere in the world where there's a strong consensus that climate change is real and we need to do something about it.
The only way we can prevent climate change being all-pervasive, being catastrophic, is by a war on climate change. Instead of economic growth being what we really want to achieve, it should be reducing emissions.
So are we facing a future of extreme weather? And what hope is there for us if these superstorms are going to get worse? Less than 40 hours after she leveled parts of the East Coast, Superstorm Sandy disappeared over the skies of Canada. On the ground, millions of Americans are picking up the pieces.
I want to go home, but there's no home. I can't go home, and that's killing me.
Thousands of homes and businesses have been destroyed.
The city of New York right now is talking about getting water out of the Battery Tunnel and preparing for a marathon. We're pulling bodies out of water.
As of the 15th of November, the death toll has risen to 199. But as the rebuilding begins, many questions remain. Are we entering a new age of superstorms? And if we are, what can we do to protect ourselves?
The lessons for the future are that these kinds of storms are going to happen more and more often. And even your average storm is going to have worse impacts because of sea level rise, because the flooding is going to be more intense. So this is the new normal. We're going to have to be more prepared for this. This kind of thing is going to be happening all over the world.
Just postulating what we think the sea level rise that's going to occur along the east coast of the United States would suggest that we're going to see more damage due to storm surge in the future.
What it shows us about the ability of nature to really negatively impact us in a very severe way. And it highlights how, even in a very modern society, in one of the most industrialized places in the United States, we can be at nature's mercy.
How much is climate change a factor in creating these superstorms?
We're living on a warming planet. Humans are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These gases are accumulating and leading to a warming of our planet, including warming of the sea surface temperatures. Now we know that hurricanes like warm sea surface temperatures. They form in the warm tropics.
There's a big debate been going on for a couple of decades now about whether we're already seeing an increase in hurricane activity and if it's due to climate change or if it's due to something else. I mean, I don't think there's very much doubt at all that we will see more and more of these throughout the century as the world warms. Now, we're talking about more powerful storms, we're talking about bigger flood events, more extreme precipitation. In other words, not necessarily more rainfall, but more of it falling in a short period. And I think most critically, drought.
We have to face a future in which we know sea level is rising by all our tidal gauges. We know climate is changing. We measure the temperature of the ocean is increasing. But these scenarios are not the end of the world, and it can be changed as we reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide. It'll take time, but we have to go to alternate energy resources.
What can modern cities like New York do to guard against another superstorm?
It's something that New York is going to have to deal with, given the numbers, literally the millions of people who are in the firing line. I think New York should probably look at building a barrage, much like London has done. There's places you could build a barrage between the Jersey coast and Staten Island, which would basically stop this kind of thing happening, protect an enormous area of very, very valuable real estate where a lot of people live.
Cities like New York can learn from other cities around the globe, like London and Rotterdam and even Venice, where they've had different combinations of engineering solutions.
But the next storm could be bigger, dwarfing Sandy and sending a surge that destroys even more.
Sooner or later, a storm is going to come. It's going to cause devastation, like we saw with Sandy, like we saw with Katrina. And there's so many parts of the United States that are vulnerable to hurricanes and to storm surge.
If climate change continues, you're going to see sea levels rising dramatically, and that redistribution of water around the planet can actually change the stress and strain within the solid Earth. And if you do that, you can trigger earthquakes, you can cause volcanoes to erupt, you can promote landslides. If they're into the sea, can generate tsunamis. And so you have this whole additional range of hazards that climate change can bring that we didn't really think about before.
Is Superstorm Sandy a portent of things to come? Have we brought about our